In this installment of Searching for Statesmen, we're talking about an issue that really has life and death impacts for people in Pennsylvania. The state fire commissioner has estimated that about 190 Pennsylvanians lose their lives in single-family home dwellings each year. That number is staggering, and yet the Pennsylvania legislature seems headed toward removing a requirement that would require sprinklers in these single-family homes, thereby wiping out all of those 190 deaths. Now, what we're asking today is, why is this happening? How is this occurring? How are building codes established in the first place? And what should the legislature be doing about this? My guest today, to start off, is a gentleman by the name of Os Marburger. Os is the president of Fire Protection Industries, and he's also a member of the Review Advisory Committee that helps to determine what building codes are set for the state. So let's begin with Os and just ask a couple of questions and let the people who are viewing this know what's happening in Pennsylvania today. Tell us first why we need building codes and how building codes are arrived at.
Well, building codes are arrived at by professionals, and almost in every instance by craft and by trade. When you think about buildings, you've got structure, you've got mechanical, you've got plumbing, you've got HVAC, you've got a variety of different crafts and trades, and every one of them requires a significant amount of experience in order to do well with it. Well, in most buildings, a lot of owners are one-time consumers. You just don't have the opportunity to get levels of knowledge. So consistent with government's intent and regulation, we're going to establish minimum standards so that you as a consumer, when you interface with a builder, have a fundamental place to start. And that is that there are requirements which will make sure that that structure is relatively safe, meets its intent, and you're protected.
So government actually required that buildings be safe and they be constructed to certain minimum standards. So they're the ones that requested this in the first place. Now, do I understand that the international and the national and the state organizations that create these codes, these professionals you're talking about, have said that a minimum standard should be sprinklers in homes?
Well, they've said it in every other building you can imagine other than the 1- and 2-family home or single-family homes for several years. When you go to an office, a new office building, you're safe. When you sleep in a hotel or motel, you're safe. In every instance, when you're in the public domain, fire sprinklers have been a mandatory requirement for several years. It's been an outstanding issue for 1- or 2-family homes. And the issue really is, the home is your castle, should we really intercede on that behalf? That argument's been ongoing for 30 years. There's nothing new about residential fire sprinklers. What is new is that the professionals at every level have finally said, it is time, because this is where people die. I think the parallel, as I see it, goes back to seat belts and inflatable car bags and things of that nature, because seat belts help you, but only to a certain degree. When they turn around and put in inflatables in and the rest of it, now you're reasonably safe across the board, but you're still not fully protected. But when you get into a single-family home, the rate of fire, the temperature, the time to egress out of a building has reduced significantly over the last 20 years. It's not the home, it's the contents and the source of fire.
So you're saying that this is analogous to where we were with the car industry 20 years ago, when we had seat belts but said, you know what really saves lives are airbags. You're saying that we have smoke detectors, we all know those work, but if you had sprinklers, we could eliminate the loss of life altogether. Is that pretty much where we are?
The practical experience over 100 years is that the odds of you dying in a fire, being severely injured, outside of some kind of a catastrophic explosion, such as a gas explosion, odds are you are going to be safe, and it's a very, very high percentage.
Now, we want to talk about that a little bit later and get into the specifics about fire and numbers and the cost and what the builders are saying and why it's controversial in the legislature. But I want you to help us understand that the codes process is not just some fabricated instrument, but it is a carefully thought out process that arrives at these things. There are some people, for example, in the legislature objecting and saying that those codes people should not be doing this, that the legislature should. What's wrong with that?
There's two things wrong with it. Let's first of all talk about the codes. The codes, if anything, are a very slow, cumbersome process. When somebody comes up with new technology that's wonderful, you're not going to find it in the codes in a short period of time. Because the people involved in writing these things are fairly large committees, and you have to build consensus on those committees. In order to do that, you have to have a lot of statistical information, history, nothing anecdotal. You're going to get them to the point for the fact you absolutely can prove, not say, not spin, not provide opinion. You can demonstrate across the
So
board.
real data being considered by real experts,
Absolutely.
and not people who are there for political reasons or running for office. In fact, isn't that exactly why they were created? Isn't that why the legislature created the review process in
No,
this whole
no
thing?
question. But I want to throw one more point in there. They're established as minimums. When you look at the content of the codes across the board, they're not over the top in any way, shape, or form. It's to the point for which you can't deny that this is a starting place of reason. But when you look at the people on these committees, and besides you have primary committees within building types, anything from the residential, but you get into commercial, mercantile, institutional, hospitals, you take experts in these particular fields, they're going to sit in these committees, and they also are multiple stakeholders in most cases. You have architects and engineers, building owners. You bring everybody to the fore who has experience in those industries, in those markets, and then they take proposals from the public. Mm-hmm. And they end up weighing in on them, and they provide substantiation. So it's not only technical, they have to justify their recommendations. And then they're voted on by those committees and by the overall code bodies themselves. So once you survive that, mm-hmm. and that's the only one I want to say, once you have survived that, questioning whether or not that's good policy is deciding the fact you just don't like the outcome, not the content. The content is unquestioned.
So the legislature sets up this body, and they don't like what this body says, so now they want to change it. And in fact, they do. The word at the Capitol is that there are several pieces of legislation that are now floating that want to reverse the whole codes process and to render it basically ineffective. Tell us a little bit about that and why people should be concerned about that.
Well, Pennsylvania, in its constitution, also says the reason the legislature exists is for the safety of the citizens of the Commonwealth. That's the preamble of the state constitution. When they created the statewide building code, they also set up right up front that it's here for one reason and one reason only. What are the minimum requirements that are in the best interest of the public? But they also said we're going to defer to the experts. What I think is spectacular about what Pennsylvania did starting in 1999 is simply say we're going to depoliticize this event. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be about individuals and what their personal interests are, or industries and their profit motives. It's going to be what experts tell us is a minimum, and we're going to back ourselves away from it. 2 years ago, in 2008, they created what they called the Review and Advisory Council. The argument had been made by some that parts of the code may not be as applicable to Pennsylvania as they are a neighboring state or some other state. One could argue that as well, but at least they created a representative board that would be there to provide redress. So anyone within the Commonwealth who felt that something within the code was adverse to them or improper or not in the best interest of the population in the state could raise that issue, and this board would meet and discuss it and look to resolve it.
And this currently happens now.
This currently happens
because
now.
You are a member of the Review and Advisory Committee.
I'm a member of it, and I'm telling you, not only do I have a lot of respect for the process, it's relatively painful.
Yeah.
Because you've got a lot of professional people all of a sudden now being charged with the idea to second guess the code body.
So what's your reaction to the legislature re-injecting itself into the process and saying, really, the RAC doesn't matter, we want to make the call from the legislature?
Well, the response to that is that really safety is not predominant anymore, nor is common sense predominant. It is political pressure that's going to become predominant.
Right.
What's at risk here was a fundamental improvement on the process that basically benefited everyone, depoliticized the process, made it a responsible, considerate, deliberative process, being turned back to the idea of the outcome of lobbying.
And tell me what's at risk, because if in fact the legislature succeeds in rolling back the codes and in tampering with the RAC and taking the decision making into their own hands, is the problem that we're not going to get professional review by architects, engineers, and builders and the people who really matter in making decisions? And if that's the case, what are the minimum standards? Are we in danger of making our homes unsafe, and why would we be heading in that direction?
I don't know why we're heading in that direction, but your statement, you summarized it very well, because some of the issues, like going back to the testimony, there was one specific issue raised relative to fire sprinklers. And the decision after 20-some years to push at this point was because of the tremendous track record. There are many municipalities across the United States that have had mandatory sprinkler requirements in 1- and 2-family homes for 10+ years. There's been economic studies done. The fact that it added the cost of the home and prevented access absolutely does not exist. In fact, most of those communities have higher resale values and are more attractive to people than neighboring communities. There are communities that had significant fire issues. They've been reduced. There's been reduction in public expense because those communities now have an individual response versus a municipal response. It actually conserves taxpayers' dollars. It reduces taxes.
So sprinklers save lives. They actually reduce tax burden for localities. They actually save people money because of what you're talking about and the insurance premium reductions and things like that. And yet this legislature is plummeting headlong toward removing this requirement and tampering with the codes. Just tell me, in a couple of seconds we have left here, what should people do about this? What are we asking people to do if they see this podcast?
They need to call their legislators and make it known that minimum safety requirements are really a responsibility of government. And provisions within those, I don't expect people to figure that they can do the homework on every issue that might come up. But the reality is professionals were created by the Commonwealth for the purpose of advising the legislature. And the legislation you're talking about, the group that they created to advise them on the validity, the veracity, the content of a change, they haven't asked their opinion. And that group has already reviewed this legislation and is to a significant majority, 11-4 in a meeting 2 weeks ago, absolutely voted against it as being bad policy for the Commonwealth.
So just so we're clear about this, the House has already passed a bill to remove the sprinkler requirement. The Senate is going to be holding a committee meeting to consider that bill and to consider amendments to roll back the codes process that you're talking about. So they're going beyond sprinklers and saying, you know what, we don't even need this code review process anymore. And your advice to people is call the legislature now, tell them not to tamper with the codes, tell them that sprinklers are a good idea, not a bad idea. Is that kind of what we're asking people to do?
Well, that's entirely what I'm asking to do. Because the alternative is to basically say that I want to live in an environment for which there's no sunlight coming in, there's no oversight by professional people, and I'm going to simply be at risk of whatever politically became expedient because somebody had an agenda.
Right.
That's not good for the Commonwealth. It's actually not good for the relationships for people across the board. And I want to add to that, it's certainly not good for emergency responders. These are volunteer people who put their life on the line, and you are significantly reducing the standards in which they have to operate.